Natalie, as I mentioned, we haven't gotten a whole lot of good news out of the Supreme Court, and we've gotten even less good news when it comes to our healthcare system. So I'm grateful to welcome you to the show to talk about a bright spot in all of that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And like you said, very happy to be talking about something that has gone well for patients across the country.
Yeah, I have a segment every other Wednesday where we look at what's happening in the Supreme Court, and rarely is there joy.
Yeah.
Rarely. So for people who are eagerly anticipating to know what the Supreme Court did in this moment, what was that issue for the court in Kennedy versus Braidwood, and how did the court ultimately rule?
Great. So I'm really excited that you're highlighting this because this is a court case that would have impacted 151 million people, including 23 million children. It really got down to the basics of the free preventive services that all of us get if you have employer insurance through your employer, all those free preventive services, the cancer screenings, the tobacco cessation discussions, a whole host of these screenings, all of us have come to rely on for as free and as part of our experience in the healthcare system, as part of saving our lives and making us as healthy as possible. There was a big question over the years through the courts and finally made it to the Supreme Court on, does this very specific body of scientific experts have the legal authority to require these insurers to cover these screenings? So when the Affordable Care Act passed, the idea that people should have free preventive screenings became very paramount, and the way to figure out which screenings people should get was then handed to a body of scientific experts, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, to look at the evidence, to look at what actually happens when people do get these screenings, don't get these screenings, to make the recommendations on, look, these are life-saving, or these can extend our lives, like, these can make us healthier. And they are the body that make the recommendations. That are then, if they have a high score, an A, or that they then will be required from insurers to be a part of the free screenings that all of us have come to rely on and be thankful for.
You know what's interesting is as you were telling that, I was going back in my memory bank and thinking about some of the advocates or some of the arguments for the Affordable Care Act, which came to be sort of derisively known as Obamacare, which has its
Yeah.
own sort of politicized history. But there was a point when, pre-existing conditions were something that were at the forefront of people's minds, because if you had a pre-existing condition, chances were you were not going to get access to health care. Preventative screenings, there was a time when that the ability for us to get access to that did not exist, and it required policy changes in order for
Right.
those sorts of healthcare advances to be made. But you're not just talking about people who are getting access to healthcare from Medicaid or Medicare. This is for people who also have so-called private insurance. And I think that's a real powerful reminder that sometimes we think in terms of very segregative approaches to healthcare, like, oh, well, you get the free state-sponsored healthcare. I have healthcare from my good job. And so we are not the same. But Natalie, is it your understanding, and I'm asking this from a space of just not knowing,
Yeah.
isn't there a whole lot more overlap and connection between the so-called Medicaid, Medicare approach to medicine and private healthcare? Like, isn't there some sort of connection such that if one of those elements is negatively impacted, it will also impact those who sit in a different insurance pool? Or are we really as separate in reality as we seem to think of ourselves mentally?
I think you're right that for a couple of reasons I can point to, that it's so much more fluid and connected than we often think about. Um, so for instance, we know, so I think if we can think about the buckets of insurance, there's Medicaid, which are for people that have low income. Um, Primarily. Then there's the marketplace, or what healthcare.gov or states now that have taken those over. There's that segment of people who make too much for Medicaid, but don't are not offered insurance through their job. So then there's that market. Then there's the employer sponsored market, like you said, people who get insurance through their job, and then there's Medicare, which traditionally is people, older adults. What's really interesting is you could think of a life path that someone has that goes through all of those. We are not like stagnant people that have low incomes only for the rest of our lives. That is true for some people, but maybe you have a low income and then you get three seasonal jobs around Christmas, and then you are make too much money, right, for Medicaid, and so you move into Marketplace, and then you don't have those seasonal jobs, and maybe it just goes down to one. And perhaps then you have the benefit then of getting a great job that does offer you insurance, and so now you've moved into the employer-sponsored coverage market, and then age, that is where all people in our country get their insurance. So it's as humans, we're not stagnant in one of those buckets necessarily. We could pass through one or two or all of those. And so as we think about the insurers that offer coverage, often in many of those, and our life experiences, the broadest idea of people being insured is more fluid, I think, than we talk about it. And then there's also an adage in healthcare that by way of where Medicare goes, so much else of the rules of the rest of health insurance goes. So if Medicare puts forward um, new rules that say if you're going to, you can't do prior authorization in certain ways for seniors, insurers start seeing the road where, okay, well, if I'm going to do that for this huge population that I insure, it's easier for me administratively to do that for the people that have employer sponsored coverage. So there's so much overlap and influence, I think is the word I want to use, that you said, and we should really be thinking about ourselves as possible being in all of those, and the rules that are for one, how are they? Is there parity across the different types of insurance?
And, part of this also for me is a matter of just basic human empathy. And I
Yeah.
think that if we had more of that in our understanding as to how we structure healthcare policies, we would be less comfortable with the idea that my sort of healthcare system is great, even if yours is less so. Because as you just walked us through those various stages, I've gone through every single one of those stages. Sometimes I doubled back to a previous stage and then came forward again. And if we had more empathy guiding how decisions are being made when it comes to how we structure healthcare, I think we would have a world where a lot more of us had access to it more consistently in ways that were going to allow for a better understanding as to the fluidity between a variety of those buckets. And then it's also interesting for me because I was born in another country, American parents, but born overseas vis-a-vis the military. And so looking at militarized healthcare and what we
And
got in
you
the
mentioned
military.
that. Yeah.
And I wasn't a veteran, I was just a dependent. And then thinking about how even within an American militarized approach to healthcare where everyone's getting what they need,
Yeah.
living in a German economy where I'm seeing my German neighbors also having access to what we would consider a universal healthcare system, and then coming back here, no longer being a dependent under 18 and having to figure it out on my own. I was like, what the heck is this? It's
Yeah.
terrible.
What is
Awful
this
system.
madness? What is the
Yes.
madness? At United States of Care, what makes us really unique as an advocacy organization is that we go across the country and talk to people about what they want from healthcare, what they hate, what they love, language they use, emotions they have, really to prove the point that there are places in this country people do agree on what they want from healthcare. And we can use that to drive political change and policy change. That was important for us to start as this organization after, for me, coming out of the Obama administration, working on healthcare.gov, implementing the Affordable Care Act. When you went out and talked to people, as you know, people were, if they didn't hear those politicized words, they were behind these ideas of what people should get from healthcare.
Yep.
Um, and very specifically to your point about empathy, there's some of the questions that we've engaged people on is about the idea of who should get access and who shouldn't. And I can tell you in the reddest parts of the country, people who you think in the bluest parts and places where people don't agree, I can tell you that people have absolute empathy for other people in the healthcare system because they know it actually is so broken. And the reason that people actually talk about, it was a really fascinating study we did where people were checking a box that said they were satisfied with their insurance. And I'm like, who are these people? We need to have a focus group very specifically with those folks. Like, why are they satisfied? No one's satisfied. And what it turns out is it's a misnomer. People are satisfied because they know other people have it worse. And so when you talk about that word empathy, there is a world in which everybody looks around and they're like, I have a cousin or my dad or somebody didn't have insurance or they were treated horribly by a doctor or they had so many bad issues with prior authorization that I'm thankful for what I have because it could be so much worse. And so I actually think there is a way to pull on those empathy lines on a lot of parts of healthcare. It's not every part. There are places that are really divisive about when it comes to body and autonomy and who gets what. There are a lot of places I can tell you after talking to people across the country where empathy is real. And if we like focused our policy solutions on those parts, I actually think we could make, instead of political progress or instead of, and you know, pet issues or reasons that, bad policy is passed, I do think that we could make progress because when I talk to people, you hear a desire for that.
Yeah. I don't think people are as quite as mean as they are portrayed to be. I mean, there are some very evil, mean people out there, but when
Yes.
it comes to some issues, when you can frame it in ways that are depoliticized, you realize, oh, were it not for your indoctrination on a particular issue, we actually do agree. And we actually
Yes.
might be able to make some headway here. And so that becomes really interesting. And we saw a lot of that coming out of President Barack Obama's experience, because when you called it the Affordable Care Act, it got one reaction. When you called it Obamacare, it got another. And I
Yeah.
remember seeing parodies of people who were basically saying, I don't want that Obamacare. You give me my Affordable Care Act. And it was like, if only you knew what it was you were actually saying.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, that's what's so great about this court case was that across political lines, people actually do really believe they should get their lung cancer screening for free, their colorectal cancer screening for free, the breast cancer screening, the tobacco and drug use screening, PrEP and HIV prevention, diabetes screenings. Like these are all the screenings we were talking about that were at risk through this court case. And we know from after the passage of the Affordable Care Act how much healthier people were.
Yeah.
Colonoscopy screenings increased to a higher rate among Black adults than white adults because of these free preventive services.
Mm.
Um, that more than a third of Black adults suffer from medical debt compared to 13% of white adults. Imagine if people had to pay for these screenings, or they didn't get the screening and they had to wait until they actually had cancer, and what that would do to medical debt and how much that does impact people of color in this country. So it is continues to be great news. The sleeper of a Supreme Court issue went the way it needed to.
And we're grateful for that. My question before we delve into the court itself is, who wanted it to be different? Like what group of people, what entities thought
Yeah.
this was a good thing to challenge, and what vision of healthcare were they trying to put forward?
So it came very much to two aspects of it. And employers who felt like they should not be required to offer very specifically the HIV screening and PrEP, and feeling like that was the divisive issue that they didn't want their employees to be a part of, that those, that they shouldn't have to offer those free screenings. I should note that that does not increase the cost for an insurer to, or for an employer to offer certain ones and not other ones. It is now a package, but a kind of religious um, opposition to offering those.
Wow.
And then also a belief, I think comes down to kind of, we saw through these specific courts in Texas, a real desire to strip away the authority of the federal government to make decisions. And so, kind of going after this one very specifically on, does this science body of experts have the legal right to make these recommendations, was really going after the desire to have the federal government have less ability to make these sort of decisions.
Wow.